webinar. Welcome to Explore Scope with the DA Toolkit. We're going to take a deep dive into one of the 21 goals from the DAD Toolkit. My name is Mark Lyons. I'm one of the creators with Scott Ambler of the DA Toolkit. And hopefully you find some value in this session. Now, this session should give you an idea of the kinds of content that we have in our new book that we just released in January that we're quite proud of. I actually intend to take it with me on coaching engagements and keep it handy so that I can pull it out to, turn to a table of strategies and say, for our situation, what makes sense for us? Why are we struggling? What alternatives do we have? Look at the proven strategies, hopefully make better decisions. So hopefully you check out the book. All right, so our agenda: why do you need to use multiple strategies for exploring scope? Choosing the right level of detail, managing your work items, and an overview of some scope modeling strategies. And then we'll follow with some Q&A. So don't be shy about putting some questions in as I talk, and then we'll spend some time at the end. I think we should have a decent amount of time to go through a Q&A. And this is the goal that we will be going through today: explore scope. Anybody who's familiar with Discipline Agile understands that we have 21 goals for every project that you're on. Doesn't matter if it's building something from new, extending a solution, configuring a package, you're still going to have these goals. And how you fulfill the goals will depend on your context. So let's jump into explore scope. Now, why do we need different strategies for exploring scope? Basic Agile tells us about using user stories and acceptance criteria, which work very well. So why do we need to talk about it more? Well, in some situations, stories might be a worthwhile technique, but in other situations, it's just quite simply not enough. So we need to understand, do we need more detail, less detail? And how are we going to structure our requirements and usability? And, so we build up this set of requirements to build out the next release. How do we organize those into something that we can prioritize, size, and become the queue for the work that has to be done? And we also need to decide what types of requirements models make sense for us. So here I would refer to you to some of our core principles from Discipline Agile, that context counts. If you need to tender out a release or an initiative to a third party, clearly a set of user stories isn't going to be enough for them to come back with a quote. So sometimes situations like that force us into a greater degree of detail than typically Agile would tell us we have to do. At the opposite end of the spectrum, if I have the business sitting next to me all day, every day, and we pair and we build out a website together side by side, you could argue maybe you don't even need to write down user stories. Maybe you could just do some noodling on napkins and whiteboards, and that's all you need. So context counts. And as you know, Discipline Agile is all about choice. There's no silver bullet, no one size fits all. We do have to think and consider what options make sense for us. The nice thing about the toolkit is that a lot of people aren't self-aware enough about what their options are. They're not like Scott and I, where we've been reading these process books for literally decades and sort of know them just off the top of our head, but not everybody's like that. So it's nice. We designed the newest book as a reference guide. It's something that you refer to periodically to help you make better decisions. So choice is good. And pragmatism. There's no silver bullet, one size fits all. Sometimes we have to do things that aren't particularly agile because it's professional to do so. This is the goal diagram from Explore Scope. It has been updated a little bit since our first book from 2012. And what I'm going to do is take us into the different decision points that we have here and talk about not all of these strategies. Unfortunately, within the time constraints here, we don't have time to do a deep dive into all the alternatives. But what I will do is cover off all the sort of default suggested starting points. We'll cover off all those. And I will take a deeper dive into some of the other more interesting selections. The way we structure the content is, in the 2012 book, we actually didn't even have the goal diagram notation defined yet. And apologize, I'm assuming that everybody has seen these diagrams before, but if you haven't, We have to make decisions on our journey in exploring scope, and the square boxes indicate the decision points, the things we need to think about. And on the right-hand side are some strategies. We should be clear, these aren't all the strategies. These are just commonly used strategies. I'll give you an example. Story mapping is storyboarding is a good technique that I've certainly often used. It's like Disney would use to animate a movie and show the flow of screens across the movie before they commit it to the artists. So there's an example of storyboards. It's not in this list, so it doesn't hurt to have other options. But what you see here is what, in our experience, seem to be the most common techniques. If the options or strategies are bold or italicized, it means that they're good places to start. And in some situations, they are what we call ordered lists, meaning that the choices at the top of the list are generally better alternatives than the ones near the bottom. And I say generally because, again, context counts. Sometimes the options at the very top of the ordered list aren't your best option. So this is where we provide some guidance around each of those options. And in the book, we talk about the trade-offs. So as an example, if you're exploring the usage and how you would use the solution, one of your options might be personas. And you might say, okay, personas, what are they? Well, we have tables in the book that describe what a persona is and the trade-offs where it might make sense to use that particular option. Now what we're going to do is we're going to jump in and take a look at some of the decisions that you need to make along your journey. And one of the first ones is, what level of detail do we need for scoping? And at its highest level, if we can just define what the business outcome is that we're expecting, boy, that would be nice if we could that's all we need for requirements documents. Sometimes I use the example of Kennedy saying that they were going to go to the moon in '69. That was an outcome. That was a goal. That's all they needed to get Congress to fund, the space mission. They didn't need a detailed requirements document before coming out with that outcome-driven need. But what we probably need in a more realistic situation is more in terms of requirements. And what we recommend you go with is a requirements envisioning, or otherwise known as a light specification. You look at this detailed specification is there, and you say, why is that? That doesn't sound agile at all. But as I said earlier, there are some situations where you may be forced into writing detailed requirements in a traditional format. So it is an option, but you see this as an ordered list, and clearly it's not your best option in most cases. And I'll talk about no models in a second, so I'll move on. So let's talk about requirements envisioning a lightweight specification. What we're talking about here is a set of lightweight models, typically captured as sketches and minimal text descriptions. And, shout out to Scott's work in Agile modeling. If you want to Google that, Scott, long before, DAD was even really created, Scott has done a lot of work in the area of Agile modeling. So there's lots of good content over on that website. Some examples are stories, personas, story maps, and low fidelity prototypes. When you are trying to come to a common understanding with your stakeholders about what they truly want and need, we've been trained to use user stories and acceptance criteria, and that's great, but they actually do have their weaknesses. I'm going to talk a little bit about those when I get into the user story section. But clearly, stories and acceptance criteria are text. And some people like text and some people like pictures. Probably what you want is both. You want some textual models and you want some pictorial models, and that's how together you can come up with that common understanding that we're looking for about what you need. One of the options is no models. And, again, why would you have that? Certainly, Mark, you need some requirements. But I gave you an example of sitting side by side, building a simple website with your product owner or business owner. And together you hash out what you need, no requirements documents required. So it goes back to context counts. Okay, let's get into the next category. So we've decided what level of detail that we want. By the way, I should mention that the goal diagram and the decision points that you see on the goal diagram is not an ordered list. So it's not like I am starting at the top one and I'm working my way through the diagram, but it's not like a checklist. You'll bounce back and forth between, let's do some usage modeling, let's do some domain modeling. So it's not sequential. Just want to make that clear. But one of the categories you want to look at is usage modeling. How do we want to use this new solution? Let's understand what the business wants and how they would actually use it. I know traditionally, pre-Agile, and even, people who are not too familiar with Agile sometimes end up delivering something, and then some stakeholders come to a demo that weren't properly involved throughout the process, and they look at this and they say, I don't know how to use this. Like, this doesn't match how I do my job. The user interface is very clumsy. I'll give you a real life example. I travel a lot, as you might understand. And I get sort of annoyed when I go to travel booking sites and it asks me for my own address. And there's a list of countries and it starts with Afghanistan or whatever, or USA is usually at the top, right? And then it's alphabetical. So I'm scrolling down looking for Canada before I select that. And then I go in and fill out the rest. That's kind of annoying for me. It should be able to sense my geographic location and know that I'm in Canada, and that should be my default choice. There's an example of where maybe somebody hasn't thought out how to use the system and actually have some empathy for me in my situation. I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. Let's go into some of the preferred choices here. So epics. Epics are essentially big stories, and sometimes you hear people talking about little rocks and big rocks for your solution. And the big rocks would be the epics, and we would break them down into little rocks that can actually be delivered in an iteration or sprint. So typically an epic is often too big to deliver in one iteration. But so what we need to do is absolutely break it down into smaller bits so that we can allocate them to iterations. Now, that's something that's typically done in a just-in-time format or 1 or 2 iterations in advance, is the actual breaking down. Epics at that level are something that the business typically understands, and some people interchange the term epic with feature. So in terms of high-level slotting functions or features or epics into release, epic is usually a good way to go in the early stages of your planning and prioritization. So on the right-hand side, you can see high-level things, big things like managing student loans or teaching a seminar, planning a seminar. Personas. Now, this isn't one of the default choices, but a few of these, as I said, I'm going to take a deeper dive. Perhaps it's because it's one of my sort of pet models that I like to do. I didn't actually really have an appreciation for personas until fairly recently, when I started to use them and realized just how valuable they are. If you're not familiar with the technique, what you do is you create a set of fictional characters and you describe them as real people. So, and talk about them and their lives. So Mary is 37. She's got a couple of daughters. She works in an insurance company. She's a customer for 3 years. Sorry, she's not a worker. And talks about Mary as a real person. She is recently divorced, has retained the family restaurant, and now she needs to look at her insurance coverage. And then we have another persona. We've got John. He works in the company. He's an underwriter, and we talk about John as a person. I've learned that this is a very powerful technique. It's a user experience kind of technique to help us to understand our clients as real people. For many years, we wrote requirements documents saying the user does this and the user does that. Well, users are people. They have lives. They have kids, and they go to soccer practices. They come in the morning and they get a coffee and they get a donut and they do check their emails for an hour, and then they jump in and process some claims. If we're going to build a system for John as an underwriter, it's really important that we understand what turns on John, what makes him tick, and what does he want to see. And I can think of a client that when you walk into their head office, what they have is models, like big life-size pictures, not quite life-size, they're like mini people, like almost life-size pictures of these people with these kinds of descriptions. And it's right in front of you when you walk into the lobby of the company. And what are they trying to do? When we go into work, we don't come in to just do stuff. We're actually building solutions for real people. So it helps us, the key word here is helps us to build empathy for who we're building the system for. So excuse me. So it's a technique I urge you to look into. I think it's quite powerful. I'll add one more slide here. An extension of using the personas is you can take the key personas, the key people that you work with in your company, and you can prioritize them. So the inner circle, Mary, she is we need to prioritize and make sure that her user experience is absolutely spot on. And as we move out from the circle, is maybe just a little bit lower priority in terms of user experience. Now, what we find is that companies that use personas, often they start to have conversations when they talk about requirement sessions, and they actually start to refer to the real people, the fictional people. Like Mary wouldn't like that, or John wouldn't like that. And everybody in that session can empathize with who John is, who Mary is, even though they aren't real people. So it's an interesting technique. I urge you to look into it. Another one, it's not a default choice, but one that certainly I've used for many years, is a use case diagram. You can hammer out a use case diagram in 15 or 20 minutes. It's not a big deal. But what I have found, and here's where I want to talk about the weaknesses of user stories, is that the thing about user stories is they lack context. And if you're brainstorming user stories, what we have seen happen many, many times is because it's unstructured, we end up having pockets of a lack of requirements coverage. Like we miss entire epics or stories within the epics we completely miss because our minds are random. And without some structured thinking and organization of the stories, this is a real danger. And there are different ways to mitigate this risk of requirements coverage. And the one that I used for many years is a use case diagram. So then I make sure that I can now do a deeper dive into each of the main goals of the system, which is what these ellipses are, to make sure that we have stories that cover off each of the goals and the people what we call actors who use the goals. So you don't have to use it. I haven't used it now for a few years. I've actually moved to a different technique that I'll tell you about shortly. Now, the previous diagram was pictorial. So there's a picture there. Very simple to do. But maybe you want to go to the next layer. Maybe you want to peel down those use cases and say, what does the basic flow look like inside that goal? When I go up to withdraw cash from an ATM, what are the kind of steps that I need to go through? What do I do and what does the system do in response to what I do? In this case, it's processing the sale. What does the cashier do and how does the point of sale system respond to what the cashier does? I'm not saying you have to do this. What we're going through it's a toolkit. These are candidate techniques that might make sense for you in your situation. And I'd also say, use what you know. If you know how to do this and it adds value for you, the Agile police aren't going to take you away. Just use the technique that makes sense for you. And, I mentioned the word toolkit. I want to throw that out here for you folks as well. In the past, we've continuously referred to Disciplined Agile as a process decision framework. And technically, that's what it is. But, we're trying to sort of up our messaging to people because, frankly, people don't understand what that is. And people don't like process. And there's an increasing backlash against frameworks is what we're seeing out there. So if 2 out of 3 of the words that you use to describe what DA is, people don't like, you probably don't get the traction that it really deserves. So rather than process decision framework, we're increasingly starting to refer to it as a toolkit, right? And it's really important that you folks all understand this in your messaging to your stakeholders, is that we recommend that you position DAD as a toolkit of strategies. If you're using SAFe, that's fine. If it makes sense for you in your situation and using SAFe, don't feel bad about that because maybe it fits. But even if you're using SAFe, you're using Scrum, you're a Scrum XP shop, you're a Kanban shop, in all those situations, you're still going to need to decide what level of detail do I need for my requirements and what models do I want to use, regardless of method or framework that you're using. So these things go together. It's not DAD or SAFe. It's DAD and SAFe, DAD and Scrum. Okay, so you're going to hear that from us increasingly. We're going to use the word framework less, and we'll be using the term toolkit more. Just a bit of information about the evolution we're going through. Another technique is user stories, right? So obviously the most common technique in Agile, there are different ways of writing user stories. Unstructured, you see here, student requests official transcripts, to very structured, where you say, as a student, I want to request an official transcript so that I can provide it to a potential employer. So there you have the role that the user is in when they use the story, the value that they want from the story, and the reason that they do it. So it's a powerful medium for writing high-level requirements, for sure. Now, I talked about previously the danger of using stories and the risk of missing entire blobs of functionality. unless you use a bit more rigorous approach. And I told you that in the past, I use a use case diagram to make sure that allow me to focus on certain goals of the system, flush out the stories. And by the way, you can bounce back and forth, right? You work on one goal, flush out some stories, and like, oh yeah, I thought of another one. So I go to this other use case and I flush out some more stories over there. Well, a few years ago, a number of years ago, I don't know, if it'd be like 5 or 8 years ago, time flies, Jeff Patton came out with a book on story mapping. And it's basically the same idea, but it looks like this. You've got the epics or features at the top, and same idea, just like a use case. Like you could argue that those epics are actually use cases. And then you flush out, go down, write sticky notes for each of the stories. And it's a good way to organize your thoughts, flush out the functionality, and organize it. Additionally, you could include scoping or release scoping in the exercise. You see here, we've got release 1 on the left-hand side and release 2 to help, and you can move things up and down to help you prioritize. I have moved from using use cases to this technique pretty much every time now. I'm involved with coaching the team as they flush out maybe a new product, a new application, or even the next release of an application. I go to this technique. And you see on the right-hand side, this is a real picture for a real session with a client. You can see the green stickies at the right-hand side, or at the top are epics, and then the yellow stickies going down are the stories. Now, I know it's too small for you to read on this diagram, I guess by design, but you probably can't see there's little purple stickies, little squares, about 1 inch by 1 inch on some of those stickies. What is that? Well, so this is sort of a reminder of the dad lessons for those of you who've understand dad, taken a course, read the book. You know that it's important to do the tricky bits, to do the tricky stories, not just the juicy bits or the high value stories. You want to mitigate risk early in the project. So what the technical people have done is the 2 columns of green stickies on the left-hand side represent the key technical risks. They're using a bunch of new technologies. And so what I asked them to do is, how can we build some of the stories to try out those different technologies, therefore mitigating the risk as early as possible? So what they did is they took a purple sticky and they put it on the yellow ones to indicate, by implementing these stories, we'll knock off a half dozen technically tricky challenges by proving that we can actually make this thing work. And again, back to dad, that's our journey towards a milestone we call proven architecture. It's a significant point of progress on any project, by the way, when you have done this and you've mitigated your key technical risks. The reason it's a significant point of progress is because since we've done the tricky bits, the rest of the release plan is much more credible because there aren't the scary bits in front of us. We've actually taken care of the hard stuff, and now it's just a matter of building out the rest. Okay, so story mapping, if by the way, I want to go back to the story mapping idea is that this is a very simple story map. There's much more to it than that. If you read Jeff's book, what he does, he goes way deeper. So the stories, he actually breaks them out into flows, different scenarios, if you will. And if you do it the way he talks about it, these story maps go right around the room and go through pads and pads of sticky notes. And essentially then that becomes a task board, and you start to pick off the sticky notes and you go implement them. And that's how he manages his project. And when I look at this, when I read the book, I kind of chuckled to myself, because essentially what that is, for those of us who've been doing this for a long time, is it's a detailed use case. It's a detailed use case with sticky notes, and yet it's a profound new practice. Some things there's nothing new in the world, right? Just different ways of doing things. So the next decision point I want to talk about is exploring the domain. Now, why would you do this? In some situations, especially in non-trivial situations, complex domains, it's important for people to get on the same page with regard to what the terminology is and entities and the relationships between those entities. I'll give you an example. And you can probably relate to this. In many organizations, nobody knows what to call their users. Are they users? Are they customers? Are they clients? I know a restaurant company that I've been working with that calls them guests. And now that terminology makes its way into requirements documents, into tests, into code, into database schemas. And guess what? People aren't being consistent. So it's really important to get all team members on the same page and say, okay, guys, we call our customers guests. So in the database model, in the code, in the documents, in the conversations, in the personas, let's use the term guests. Okay, so that's a really important lesson, from experience, that you might want to get everybody on the same page with terms of terminology. Not hard to do, and there's techniques here. So I'm going to go through one of them, which is the domain concept model. Now, domain concept model is kind of a super term for different ways to modeling your domain. You could call it a class diagram. A class diagram is a kind of domain model. So what you see on the left-hand side here is a low fidelity. Somebody's gone up to a whiteboard and wrote down the key entities, things, if you will, that are involved in our system. It's enrollment into a course. You got students and loans, and professors and things. And the lines between them indicate the relationships between them. And very similar for those of you who have a database background, you can see the relationship. I can read this and see that a professor has, at the other end of the arrow towards seminar, you see 1 star, which means one or more seminars. And going the other direction, the seminar, and then follow the line to the professor, the seminar has 0 or more professors. It's a good way to understand the relationship. So we get alignment on terminology and relationships between the entities, which actually translate into business rules to make sure that you've got at least, on the far hand side here, a student has one and only one loan. I actually might challenge that to say maybe a student doesn't have a loan at all. So maybe it's a bit, but you know what I just did? I just learned something from this diagram, and now we can have a conversation, because this is going to translate into code. Every time I create a student, do I have to create a loan? Well, no. Okay, then it should be 0.1, not student has one and only one loan. So I just showed you a real example. I just noticed that, right? Where diagrams are amazing for generating conversation to get everybody on the same page. On the right-hand side, we see a class diagram that's been done by a tool. Kind of looks like a rational tool to me. Dating myself. All right, let's move on to the next area. So get alignment on terminology is the point to the next one, especially in complex domains. Process. We talk about in Discipline Agile, it's not just about building software, right? We're delivering solutions. And sometimes those solutions require changes in the business process. In fact, many times they do. And there's different ways to show the interaction between the people and the system, or the people and other business processes that have nothing to do with the system. I won't go through all the examples. For instance, I'm not going to go through state chart, but what is that? The state chart is used in sort of unique situations where maybe you're building telecommunication software, defense systems, where life insurance policies, where things go through a life cycle. You apply for a policy, it has to be underwritten, it gets approved. One day there's a claim against it, maybe it expires, maybe it renews. These are examples of states, and they can be very complex. Even in insurance, it can be quite complex. So it's really good to depict what states does the life cycle of an entity or thing go through, and what states can they go to directly, and what states can they go back to. I remember a situation where, because they didn't understand states, a mortgage origination company, if you wanted to change the terms of the mortgage, you actually had to cancel the mortgage and reissue it and basically start at the beginning, because nobody realized that you should actually be able to change things without terminating the mortgage. Again, these kinds of diagrams can help us get on the same page. Let's talk a little bit about a business process diagram. Now, this, you might look at this and I think we talk in the book that it's a pretty rich notation. If you're not familiar with business process modeling notation, it's very rich. It's very similar to the kinds of things you can do in UML. And in very complex business situations, it can certainly get rid of ambiguities. The danger is that people learn a new notation and then they want to diagram the entire business using a notation like this, and that could be a multi-year effort. And of course, it's just like a big upfront requirements document, albeit diagrammatic. And we don't want the burden of having to maintain that. But just like anything, there are situations where you might want to take a piece of your business process and there are changes to it. Maybe you want to do before and after. Yeah, this is a pretty cool notation to map out your business processes, but not particularly agile. That's the warning, is that there's a lot in this notation. It can be quite complex. So you could be going down a rat hole if you go too far into this. Just another tool in your toolkit you might want to look into. And then the user interface. How do we explore the user interface to make sure we're on the same page? Pretty standard stuff. Prototyping. It can be manual prototyping. It can be using a tool. It can be low fidelity. It can be high fidelity. I'll show you a couple examples here. Here's an example of a user interface flow diagram. Explores how various screens and reports fit together. In this example, low fidelity, Agile up on a whiteboard, somebody take a picture of it. Give everybody understand how we can navigate through the application and where we can go. Quite useful. An example of prototyping, low fidelity. I believe these are Scott's drawings. He's trying to make a point that you don't always have to use a fancy tool. You can do it manually. But I was going to show you, we do have another screen in one of our courses that shows a high fidelity example of a mock-up of a screen or a web page. You could do that if you like. I can think, if you're into user experience modeling, and this is serious stuff. It's not to be trivialized. Some companies spend a lot of money and time doing user experience modeling, and there's some pretty cool tools out there. I think about a company that I've been working with recently that has a mobile app, Android, iOS, iPad, web. They want consistency of user experience across platform, and doing it on a whiteboard just while it's agile isn't going to get everybody on the same page. It's the quality of images and resolution and colors and all that stuff. I just just want to throw out sort of a kudo to UX specialists. It is quite a science, and increasingly important in our industry, by the way. Now, this is definitely not one of the recommended strategies in exploring your user interface, a UI specification. I felt it was important to address this because I go into some organizations and this is one of the standard 10 documents that they do around requirements every time. Obviously not Agile, right? And one of the biggest culprits I see, one of the greatest time wasters and killers of trees, is a user interface specification. Now, if that's what some of you do back home, I'm not trying to insult you, but I'm saying that in my experience, they are extremely volatile. Some of the areas of greatest volatility in any solution are in the UI and on the data side, at least initially. And what I see these documents that say, here's a drop-down box and it's got states and they're ordered in this fashion, and it's this font and this color and reference this image and all these kinds of things. And it's no wonder, I've seen these things 100+ pages. And UI continuously changes, and every time it changes, somebody goes into that document, prints it out, gives it to the developer again, kills a few trees, and here's the dirty little secret. Developers don't read them. Okay, so they might read it the first time, but after that, they're like, I'm not reading this again, just tell me what's changed. And not Agile, right? You don't just drop a spec document on developer's desk and say that UI has changed, make sure that you make the changes as well. Conversation. Now, I sometimes get people coming back to me and saying, but Mark, how do we test this? How are the testers going to know what's in that drop-down box and what the sort order is and what the default choice is? And is it multi-select or single select? How am I going to know that? And my response to that is, if a tester has to rely on a written document to understand how the UI works, then there's a serious problem in understanding the Agile mindset and conversations. I would much rather develop, and by the way, developers are smart people. They typically can design a pretty darn good UI to maybe 80% of where it needs to be. And then, so let them spend a couple of hours on something and give it to a tester, a business person. And I guarantee you, within 5 minutes, they'll tell you that the drop list has the wrong values, is sorted wrong font, whatever. And think of all the time and trees that you've saved by not putting it in, committing it to a written document. Okay, that's my little rant on UI specs. So be careful with those. Like everything, context counts. There might be a reason you want to do it, but I generally don't see a need for that anymore. General requirements, I'm not going to go a deeper dive into this, but this is sort of like the miscellaneous category. There are other types of requirements documents you may wish to do. If you're in a very sophisticated business domain, you will probably want to document some business rules. And how you do it, we don't tell you how. There's different ways of doing it, but we certainly agree that you might want a business rules document. Where you put those business rules is always an interesting conversation. You could put the business rules, tie them to a story so that they are, let's say you're using a tool, you'd have a section for your acceptance criteria and maybe a section for business rules underneath that, where maybe the acceptance criteria is a little bit too high level. Or you could have a common business rule document that's shared across all the stories. Context counts. You're going to have some people that say, don't even put it anywhere. Just put it right into the code. Your business rules should be in the code and your code should be readable. That's for some organizations where stakeholders are comfortable reading code. I'm just telling you there's options around business rules. Other ideas here, impact mapping is an interesting technique you might want to look into to help you understand what are your goals, who is going to move forward with the goals and create impact, and what do we expect to achieve, and what are the results, what are the deliverables that we need to do to create this impact. And shall statements, you know what, to be honest with you, I can't remember the last time I saw a need or a context where shall statements, traditional, system shall do this or I shall do that. I don't typically see the need for those anymore, but context. And then quality requirements. Okay, so what do you do with your non-functional requirements, your usability, reliability, performance, and supportability? Time check here, doing okay. Where do you put them? Also an interesting discussion. You could put non-functional requirements next to your functional requirements as acceptance criteria. So an acceptance criteria, you've got acceptance criteria to say, when I do this, then this should happen. It's a functional requirement. But maybe you've got an acceptance criteria that's around performance that says, upon submitting the order, control is returned to the user within 2 seconds, as an example. So there's an example of a non-functional requirement, a system-wide, also known as a system-wide requirement. If your general performance requirement across the system is 2 seconds, and you've got 100 stories, then you're potentially writing at 100 times, 100 different places. And if it changes from 2 seconds to 3 seconds, guess what? You've got a maintenance issue. Some people will actually take them out of the stories, and if they are truly system-wide requirements, put them into one place, maybe in an explicit list format, to say these are generally across all the stories are performance requirements and usability, reliability, supportability requirements all in one place. And you could have a part of your definition of done for every story. It says not only does a story have to fulfill the acceptance criteria, it also needs to have fulfilled our commonly understood system-wide or non-functional requirements, quality requirements. Okay, so that's a tip for you in terms of maintenance. Now you're going to have some situations where, let's pretend you're a grocery store and you're scanning items. Your performance requirements are not 2 seconds every time you scan a can of beans. It might be for your back office reports, but maybe it's 1/10 of a second. So if you want to override your system-wide requirements, then the guidance might be to embed those with your other acceptance criteria that are applicable specifically for that story, and they override the system-wide requirement. Okay, so acceptance criteria, I've got a couple slides on what I just said. What you see on the left-hand side is acceptance criteria. And what you see here is it's written in the standard BDD, given, when, then format. It's a very good way to understand a precondition for a test. Then you execute the test, and now it becomes like stimulus response. When I do this, then this is expected. So set the test up with a given statement, then a bunch of when I do this, then this should happen. When I do this, then this should happen. Now, these are what you should be writing early in your project. If you have an inception, you don't have to have an inception, but if you have one, you would typically write out a handful of these acceptance criteria for each of your stories. But you notice there's no values here. It doesn't talk about the student number or any of the business rules or any of that kind of stuff. Once you get into building it in your iterations, you're going to actually have to have real values to say, when I take this much money out of my account and it had this balance, then reduce the balance to this should be the new value. That's commonly in the old days, we used to call those test cases. So that nowadays they're called acceptance tests. So you have acceptance criteria, don't have values. Then we have acceptance tests that actually have the real values. And those are typically firmed up either just before the iteration or during the iteration. Some people ask me, what do the people who are testing specialists, what do they do while they're waiting for stuff to be built? Well, they're typically getting ready to test. And they might take these acceptance criteria, start to create a one-to-many relationship between an acceptance criteria and a set of tests with real values, and then be ready to execute them. And it can be low tech. You can put them into an Excel spreadsheet if you want to. I see that done a lot. Or you can automate them. Yeah, so this is automated acceptance testing. You can use tools like Cucumber and there are other tools that can actually feed the acceptance tests into the system, which is kind of a cool technique. It's what we call business readable tests. And when your business thinks of a different scenario, a different test, they don't need to get a developer involved like you would in a unit test situation. They can just write it in English and submit it to the system without having a developer involved. So it's an advanced DAD toolkit technique, but increasingly being done. And I already talked about the explicit list idea, where you've got a commonly used set of non-functional tests that are used across stories. All right, we're getting close to winding down. Modeling strategies. So that's great. We understand the level of detail for our scope. We understand, we decided which types of techniques we're going to use for our situation, which models, combination of textual and visual models, and how do we get this information? Now, at the bottom of it, we have one-on-one or group interviews. A better session is to get everybody in the room and either do joint application requirement sessions, open space, which is one big room, everybody in the room, focusing on different aspects of the solution and hammering it out. Most commonly, we see agile modeling sessions. And here's an example, actually, real life modeling sessions. I referred you to the one on the bottom right. This is in action. And what you see here, the fellow in the blue shirt, Paul, he is the product manager. And the guy at the board is the product owner. And just by the way, people just last week were in a workshop, and people seemed to getting stuck on the idea of a job title and a role. And they're actually creating job descriptions with the title product owner. That used to be, I don't know, a business analyst 2 or something like that. I strongly encourage you not to do this. You do not want to tie an agile role to a job title and a pay band. I've seen situations where in one solution, one application, one release, a number of product owners, one was a business analyst and one was a director, okay? And nobody cared. It was the right thing to do. That's where the domain knowledge lied, and it made sense for those two people to be in the product owner role. So please don't associate agile roles like architecture owner, product owner, team lead to a job title. And as you know, I'm sure you know that team leads can be rotating within the team. It not necessarily is a long-term thing tied to a title of project manager, as an example. You can do this, and it sometimes happens. That's the way it's associated. But beware, that's a huge anti-pattern. So anyway, you've got the product owner at the board, and we've got the product managers sharing his vision for what he wants from his new claim system. And then we've got some use case modeling going on at the top right. So much fun. Okay, now when we get all this collective understanding of what our scope is, then where are we going to put this stuff? Because we need to prioritize it, we need to size it, and get it into the funnel and start to build it out. And we've got various strategies here. I'm going to go through some of them. And the one at the very bottom is unmanaged chaos. We don't have them written down anywhere. Probably not your first choice. All right, let's talk about some of the favorite choices. One is a work item pool. So this is a lean approach, and think of it like swim lanes or buckets. For those of you who have difficulty getting your head around, what is this exactly? How does it look in real life? If you use Jira, you can think of it as a filter. So you could filter by business value or fixed date or defects, learning items, technical debt. Excuse me. And then you pull the work as you have the capacity to build it. One of the reasons this is at the top of the list in terms of what we think is probably where you want to go, at least over time, is that the beautiful thing about pools is the priorities can change on a daily basis, and we don't care. If we're using a lean life cycle, we haven't locked ourselves into a 2-week iteration where we have to do this, where scope change is generally discouraged within that iteration. In a lean idea, I work on something and I'm heads down working on it with my team. And if priorities are changing every day, I don't really care, because when I'm done this thing and I'm ready to pull something else in, that might have arrived an hour ago. It is the most important thing at that moment in time. So you're always building the most important thing. Lean has a saying, defer commitment until last responsible moment. And that's what we're doing here in terms of our prioritization. So it's an interesting way to group your work. And it's complementary to our second technique, which is a task board. And you see here, this task board is basically a lean task board with swim lanes where we pull stuff across the board as our capacity is to deliver it. Now, I'm not going to go into all the nuances of how to create these boards and talk about minimizing work in progress, WIP, and using constraints, and what columns do you want to use. But you can do the homework and how to create a good task board. Context counts, but definitely it's a recommended technique. Visualize your work, right? Agile has a saying that says no hidden work. Everything that everybody's working on should be up on the board. Now, work item list, this is more appropriate if you're using an Agile-based lifecycle, which, at the heart of it uses a Scrum XP Agile modeling approach. Key differentiator, it has iterations versus the Lean, which has pool. And so this is, what Scrum calls a backlog, we call a work item list, because we allow basically any kind of work to come in here. If it's got work that's got to be done, it doesn't necessarily have to be a story. It could be all different kinds of work. It could be ordering a server, procuring an environment. It's kind of funny. I see out there people have been sort of brainwashed into everything's a user story and everything's a Scrum backlog. So they say, as a DevOps engineer, I need to order a production server so that we can put the system into production. It just makes me laugh. Think outside the box, folks. Not everything needs to be written as a user story. One of the key differentiators about the work item list is, for those of you who have learned DA, you know that we, as related to a previous discussion, we want to prioritize the work by not just value. Value is important, but if I'm not going to deliver for a few iterations, then I've got some flexibility with my prioritization. I can take those tricky bits, those bits related to technical risk, and I can bubble them up in the stack. And let's try to build the hard bits first, mitigate those risks. So that's one of the differentiators about a work item list, is that we consider risk. It's a risk value life cycle. It's risk, not just value. Now, in real life, do I call it a backlog? Do I call it a work item list? I call it a backlog probably as much as I do WIL, but use the terminology that makes sense for you. Okay, so right on time. So parting thoughts. If you're using user stories and acceptance criteria, that's awesome, but you're likely going to need to supplement them with other models, both textual and diagrammatic. Now, be careful. One of the things about having this rich toolkit that is disciplined Agile is that sometimes there's a temptation to do more than you really need. It's like, wow, there's impact maps, and there's mind maps, and there's use cases, there's this and that. Do the minimal possible. I can't stress this enough. Remember principle 10 from the Agile Manifesto, simplicity. The art of maximizing the amount of work not done is essential. So you should be vigorously looking for opportunities not to do stuff. But if you do nothing, then that increases the risk that we're going to miss and not deliver what our business truly wants. So find that balance. And I tell you a little story is that I went into an insurance company, and they said, it was an underwriting group, and they said, Mark, we currently, our standard binder says that we have to produce 11 requirements documents for every system. And they were moving to DA. And they said, help us out. Because I know you said you got these options, but you've done this before. Which modeling strategies do you think we should use in a situation? So I went there. We did I think it was a 2-day workshop, and we ran through an example of a release that a new sort of application they were getting ready to build. And what we landed on was stories and acceptance criteria, personas, story mapping from Jeff Patton, storyboarding to show the flow of the screens, and I think there's one I'm missing. Oh yeah, annotated wireframes. So essentially UI mockup, but rather describing every little widget and what goes in it, they'll call outs to say, in this drop list, these are the values I expect to see. So just the parts where it wouldn't be obvious to the developer, they could put on a PowerPoint slide or something, how they wanted that part to be treated. So they ended up with like 5. And important to understand, oh, by the way, one of the ones they had was this UI specification document. They were so thrilled that they never had to do that anymore. And the 5 might sound like a lot, but they're really lightweight models. They're not a lot of work, and only 2 are textual, the user stories and the personas, and the rest are diagrammatic. Okay, so much leaner way of them doing the requirements. So remember, choice is good. we're not going to tell you one way to do things, but we do provide you in the book. We show the trade-offs. That's one thing I didn't show you, but like in these slides, is that there's a lot more content obviously in the book. We show the goal diagrams, the decision points, what each of those options are, and what trade-offs are, where, in what context they make sense for you. And we don't pretend to tell you everything there is to know about story mapping or TDD or anything like that. If you want to learn about story mapping, we have references, lots of references in the book. And you can just say, oh, Jeff Patton, user stories or story maps. And off you go. You can get the ebook and learn how to do that if that's the way you want to go. Okay, so context counts. Modeling strategies you choose should suit your situation. All right, so with that, I'm going to go to the next slide. And before we open it up for Q&A, I believe that Pam is going to throw up a poll. So how would you rate the value of this webinar to you? And let us know what you think. Okay. Now, I think Pam's going to leave that up there for a few more seconds. Still waiting on a few people. By the way, the attendance is really good. So thank you for showing up. Appreciate that. All right. Well, there's a minute, Pam. I think we can probably close off the poll. Oh, do I do that? Okay. Oh, it's done. And I'm going to share out the results. Okay. So looks like generally good feedback. That's good news. Good news. Good news. I want this stuff to be valuable for you. All right. Now, Pam, I'm having the QA dialogue does not want to come up for me. So maybe you could read the questions for me. We have, and feel free to keep adding questions. We've got about 10 minutes, 8 minutes, sorry.
Okay, David's asking, we're struggling to write stories where the goal is to remove features. What suggestions do you have? What choices do I have?
What choices, where do you remove features?
Where the goal is to remove features, what suggestions do you have?
Okay. Well, there's not a goal around that. I mean, so if you look at the goals of Disciplined Agile, they're goals that you would need to fulfill to deliver the solutions to our stakeholders that they want. And I don't think we would say that a goal of delivering a system, like a high-level goal, is to remove features. Do we want to minimize scope, do a minimal marketable release and avoid feature bloat? Absolutely. But that's, I would say that would be in our managing change, is that, you know, to what degree do we accept change, is where we would address that goal.
Okay, and he's actually just adding another question, and coming up with a testing strategy that's challenging when removing features.
Yeah, so I'm going to go right back and show you. It's a great question, by the way. You know, when we first came out with the first release of Disciplined Agile in 2012, the book, we did not have a goal in inception of, as you see here, the sixth one down, develop test strategy. And, you know, applying this out in the field, the testers during the inception workshops would say, hey, what about us? You know, how do we test this thing? Where are we going to get the test data? How much is automated? How much is manual? What testing tools do we need? How are we going to write our test cases? Are they going to be acceptance criteria? On and on and on, right? And so, oops, that was a big miss. We fixed that a few years ago. Now in Inception, it's a very robust goal diagram. I encourage you. It does talk about, you know, most of the things that you need to think about as you set up a test strategy. So that's a great question. Then there's lots of content in data about that. Okay, next question.
Okay, Joel's asking, UI spec may be volatile, but a geographical visual style guide is a core part of keeping consistent UX. Perhaps a longer sidebar discussion?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely.
File
So
guide also tends to be long lasting.
yes, so thank you for that, Joel. Absolutely. We have a goal aligned with enterprise direction, and in there we talk about and leverage and enhance existing infrastructure. You want to reuse what you have, and having guidelines and templates and those kinds of things, those are accelerators. So things like design guides and such, absolutely critical. I didn't talk about this in terms of exploring scope, but you should definitely have those reference guides. Next question.
Okay, David's asking, are you saying that standards and guidelines for UX are not recommended? This helps teams.
No. Yeah, okay. So continue, Pam.
Oh, are you
This
saying
helps
that,
teams.
sorry, are you saying that standards and guidelines for UX are not recommended? This helps teams produce consistent outcomes. I'm not sure I agree.
Yeah, and you shouldn't. If that's what I came across, I apologize. In fact, I tried to do the opposite, to give a shout out to UX. Having worked with some UX specialists in the last few years very closely side by side, I've certainly learned a lot about their art and their discipline. And yes, we need style guides. We need all the discipline that they bring to it. Definitely. In fact, what I'm seeing out there is a lot more investment up front in trying to iron that stuff out before you commit it to the teams to start to build features on those whatever should be relatively standardized users experience. I know that all of us have probably experienced bad user experiences on mobile versus web, or the other way around, and we expect, as we go from device to device, from browser to mobile, to kind of have the similar experience. So totally on side with that, and I apologize if I came across the other way. Next question.
Okay, and just one last question from David. We're constantly being asked for standards and guidelines for development for some of the UX we do here at OL.
Okay, I just heard we're constantly be asking for standards, and then you cut it.
Oh, for development for some of the UX we do here at OL.
Yes. I know which David this is. Yes, totally, and that's good. I mean, David knows I've worked with him, and he and the company have invested some time in overhauling their UI. That's all good.
Okay, and Marcin asks, while businesses use UML modeling, who should handle the ERD modeling, IT or architects?
So interesting. The business, I showed you an example of business process modeling notation, BPMN, which is slightly different than the unified modeling language, which is UML. UML was primarily designed by IT for IT. Certainly doesn't have to be the case. There's lots of business people that learn how to do activity diagrams and use case diagrams and some of the more business and class diagrams. So business people have been taught to use UML very successfully. But if you get into very rich business situations with handoffs and business processes and stuff that's done in parallel and when it meets and stages and all that kind of stuff, business process modeling notation is quite rich. So we often see business folks learn BPMN and maybe a bit of UML, but the UML models is not, I say IT architects, well, it depends on the type of model that you're doing. The last I looked into it, UML had something like 13 different types of diagrams. So structural diagrams to show what the system looks like at rest, if you will, as well as dynamic diagrams that show how the system behaves when it's moving. So, and the people who use those diagrams will be different stakeholders. Could be architects, could be architecture owners, could be any team member. I think back in situations where any team member has gotten up in front of a whiteboard and started to do, as an example, a sequence diagram to show the flow of the code that you're building, and trying to get feedback from the people on their team before they commit it to code. All right.
Hey, Eric has a question. Do you have a suggestion on how to manage a purely technical backlog?
Yeah, probably don't want to write user stories. I told you my little joke about that. And don't get wrapped around what somebody in some Agile course has told you this is how you write it. And this is where I see a lot of stress from Agile team members, where they're trying to cram what they have done in the past into this thing called Agile, where everything is supposedly a user story. I would say, technical work should be put into a work item list and write it in whichever format makes sense for you and that is consumable by the people who need to understand what's in that backlog or work item list and prioritize the work, size it. So it should be written in the terminology of the people who are responsible for the prioritization of that work. I sometimes see technical work items in a work item list that, and then the work item list also has functional requirements in it, and it's owned by the product owner, but the product owner doesn't understand half of what's in the list because it's written in something, do this with Kubernetes or whatever. They have no idea how to rank that in terms of value. So that would be my advice, is try to make it, write it in the terminology for the people who maintain it and prioritize it and size it.
Okay, David just wanted to expand it on his question. How does one describe this by a product owner? He thinks the question may have been misunderstood about removing.
Can you say that again, Pam?
I think the question may have been misunderstood. We are removing features. How does one describe this by a product owner?
I'm not really sure I understand. David, maybe you can contact me offline and we can talk about this. But when you take features out, you probably want to think about whether you're taking them out of a release or taking them out of the work item list forever. If it's just it's a scoping thing, and you can't bring it into this current release, then move it down in the backlog rather than taking it out completely. In fact, this is one of the advantages of Agile over traditional, where in the past, if it wasn't in the scope document, then project managers tended to say, go away, don't talk to me about this, is out of scope. It might have been a brilliant idea for some release someday. In the new world, we don't say go away, I don't care. We say we can't put it into this release, add it to the bottom of the backlog, and it will get prioritized for the next release. That's also a good way, by the way, of building a business case for the next release. We call this continuous elicitation of requirements, not just a project mentality where you don't have any backlog to work from. They're one of the reasons, by the way, that inception can be greatly reduced or potentially even go away if you capture new requirements as you go. They're not part of the release, then you have your backlog in place, ready for the next release without committing a week or two to do that.
Mark, can I jump in on this?
Please do.
Yeah, so I would just write it up as a simple story, and not really call it a tech deck story or whatever, but certainly not as formal as a user story, and along the lines of remove feature X because blah blah blah, because I want to see some sort of a reason. And then write it up on a card or put it in Jira, whatever your tool of choice is, and prioritize it and get to it just like you normally would. So from a lean point of view, that's like a tech debt, it's tech debt removal or addressing tech debt piece of work. So
sure.
Yeah, write it up, keep it simple.
Thank you. I think most of you know that was Scott. Any more questions, Pam?
Yeah, Krishna is asking how to estimate the features.
Different ways. We often see different techniques, such as, and by the way, we have that in our goal diagrams. We have different estimating strategies. You could use t-shirt sizes. If at the higher level, probably story points is a little bit too granular for what you want to do. So we often see like small, medium, large, extra large t-shirt sizing. There's also a technique called weighted shortest job first that SAFe has made popular, WSJF. So that includes considerations like lost opportunity cost and job size in your prioritization. It's a bit more richer than just t-shirt size. So you have options.
Okay, and a question from Drennan. Hi, Mark, great webinar. How do I coordinate lightweight specs at scale? The context here at BAs collaborating across teams in a corporate environment for large compliance projects.
That's tough to answer without a little bit more context. But I guess what you're looking for is trying to understand or trying to minimize the dependencies between the different groups. So it's a complicated question because it goes into, it's essentially that, minimizing dependencies between groups. So you want to do your modeling that essentially encapsulates it between the groups and then maybe just define interfaces between it. And then you need some high level diagrams. I mean, it could start as high level as a context diagram, which is super high level, and then peel back that onion and use whatever technique makes sense for you. It could be an activity diagram. It could be story mapping, data flow modeling, all different types of techniques. Sorry, not a very good answer to the question, but I would need to know a little bit more context.
Okay, and it looks like one last question from Joel. Seems to me that separating technical work items from the user-focused stories encourages silo building and waterfall-like execution plans. Maybe misunderstanding your comment about technical work items.
Yeah, so that definitely should not be the case. We're not talking about separating the implementation of the stories into technical work items or layering or anything like that. It's just that some work may not be tied to a story. Like maybe you've got a story that's already built. Okay, it's built, implemented, tested, but when people were building it, the developer said, "Oh, this is a mess, and it needs to be fixed one day." And particularly this particular module, I think that's about an 8. And so rewriting it, refactoring it, getting rid of that technical debt is not going to add any visible value to the business. But long term, it will result in higher quality, easier to maintain. So there's a business case to be made for actually refactoring it. So that is separate from a story. It doesn't add specific visible business value, but it should be prioritized with other value-oriented work as well. And it's a classic problem we see in organizations, that they don't have any mechanism for prioritizing their technical debt, their technical work, alongside the value work, so it never gets done. Or it gets done by development teams subversively, just because they know it needs to be fixed, and they know it's too much hassle to get the business to prioritize the refactoring. And then, of course, that violates the principle of no hidden work, deadline slip, bad things happen. So let's make it visual. Let's have a discussion about the value of the technical work. It doesn't have to be refactoring. It could be, as I said, I made a silly example of ordering servers or something. But this is work that has to get done. And a classic sort of more naive Scrum approach is just to put stories in the backlog. But there's all this other work that has to be done by the team or other people that should be prioritized and visualized, so people know. And that could be business work. It doesn't have to be just technical work as well. It's a communication mechanism. Make sure stuff doesn't get dropped. Otherwise, if we don't put it into the work item list, we often find it either doesn't get done, or our estimates or sizing is wrong because we didn't know this work was being done. So transparency is a good thing. Okay, I think we're out of time.
And we're out of questions.
Well past. Okay. Well, thank you, everyone. Just a last pitch. If you haven't checked out the book, we're very proud of it. It's big, but it's a reference guide. We think that if you use this to reference these ideas we talked about today, which are, of course, discussed in much more detail in the book, we think you'll make better decisions, and better decisions will lead to better outcomes. So thank you all, and we'll see you at the next webinar.